Okay, thank you. When I arrived here, I was invited by the library and others, and I wasn't thinking of doing a presentation, but then I think on Monday we said, well, let's try and put something together. So what I'm talking about is not only Umeå, but the bigger context, etc., etc. So if that's okay, and I will try and interweave Umeå into this. Obviously, my first impression was, of course, the wonderful light, and I'm obsessed with these lovely lights you have here, but that's not very important, but it's important to me. Now, the central question, I think, for all places all over the world is that things are obviously changing, and so the idea, or people talk about the idea of things like the creative city. So why is that important? Now, obviously, we all know the sort of transformations that have happened, but I suppose some of them are really very, very, very big, and that does require us to sort of rethink quite a lot where we're going. This just reminds us that obviously, you know, the world is changing dramatically and it's shifting towards the east. As we know, that's where production is increasingly happening. So the world axis is changing. I think the other thing we know is, of course, there's much more mobility. The world has become a smaller place in some sense. It's more connected in all sorts of ways, physically and virtually, and so on. And of course, you know all of that. And within that, there's obviously massive, I suppose, competition, whether we like it, and although you love to collaborate, Umeå is in competition with Lund and all of these other cities in relation to the City of Culture proposal. Now, within that, this is from your museum, within that, obviously, many things in these changes are sort of disappearing, and that, in some sense, is sad, and the question really is how one can maintain a combination of sort of old values with new values in one way or another. This guy here, unfortunately, in Beijing is walking downstairs and the woman looks quite bright. But some people say that all of these combined changes are like a paradigm shift. Now, whether that is or isn't the case doesn't really matter, but it's pretty dramatic, I think, if we look at it. And here's just an example. Toronto Stock Exchange, look what it gets transformed to, a design exchange. This is sort of emblematic for me that I walk past this building and they take all the stock exchange away and then they put design exchange. Now, of course, what that means is money is in a sense less important than the ideas that are generated, let's say, through a design exchange. And of course, last night we went here, and this is just a manifestation of some of the adaptations that you've had to make, and this is obviously was a response 40 years ago to rethink the city as a university city. I know this is a hospital, but it's sort of also quite important. It's a regional centre, and so on. So the question that most people are asking is whether we can revitalize or reincarnate cities and so on, and obviously I believe that you can in one way or another. But the key question is whether the mindset we have is really there or in the right place to confront the sort of issues that we're facing. And, you know, are you, of course, the city of birches, or are you all vegans? I don't know if you are all vegans, but the hardcore, clearly, how many vegans are in this room? There are no vegans, so this is all a lie. This is just this little punk group that are vegans. Anyway, now clearly, one of the major shifts in this is how we think about things determines, obviously, everything we do. Now, in the past, I suppose you could say that people have looked at the city as if it's a machine. Whereas I think, and many people know this, of course, and it's not new, that if you look at it as an organism, you come up with completely different solutions. In the machine view, everything is a separate technical issue. In the organism view, everything is interconnected and interwoven. Or if you look at this in a different way, you might say, in the older view, we talk about urban development and urban projects. But in the newer view, we talk about place making. So a project is never in isolation. It always speaks to its neighbour. For example, if we build a terribly ugly building, it's likely to stay ugly for a very, very long time and be there for a very, very long time. So the question of placemaking versus just doing a project is quite significant, and that obviously has implications on how we do strategic planning and visioning in a city. Another way you could look at that is to say that this older way of looking at things is the urban engineering paradigm, very much based on hardware, whereas a more modern way of looking at cities is about creative city making, and that again leads to a different outcome. Or you could say that in that older way it was more hardware focused. It shapes the mindset, very departmentalized, silos and so on. Whereas in this other way, you might say you're combining software thinking with hardware thinking. You're looking at relationships as well as the projects and stuff like that. But particularly, you look at the city in a more sensory way. You look at the emotional, psychological effects of building and physical structures around you and roads and so on. So this way of thinking is probably more holistic. So if we just take an example, in the older way we often talk about numbers. Are we going to grow? Is it bigger? Whereas now people talk about more the quality of things. In the past people said, for example, 100 years ago, all the most important cities in the world were the biggest cities. That is not the case anymore. So the question now is, what is the right size rather than just the size? These are just small examples. Or in the past, people often, and you didn't, I know you have been very advanced in Umeå, thought of culture as a cost, whereas people regard it as an asset that moves center stage in development. Or if you looked at another way of thinking about these things, in the past we might have thought sustainability was economic, environmental and social, whereas now we would say culture is the fourth pillar of sustainability. We might say in the past waste is something that is waste, it's out of mind, out of sight. Or now we might say waste is actually a resource and an opportunity. So you can see that this is a different way of thinking. In the past you might have said moving around is about transport and roads, and that then means the person in charge perhaps is an engineer or so, whereas today we would say mobility and accessibility and connectivity is key. So you might have someone who's very interested in pedestrians or how people connect and relate. So anyway, you get the idea. There are completely different ways of thinking. And finally, I suppose, do you think things together in an interdisciplinary way, or do you think about it in that multidisciplinary way where we're all stay ourselves, have a conversation in partnership but don't change?